Saying no is no longer sufficient. You really have to up your boundaries game in this day and age, especially when it comes to dating and relationships and even friendships. So let's dig into it.
Welcome to the Secret Formula of Femininity for women who want to live a more feminine, fun, and fabulous life. I'm Dr. Nicole Montero, your host on this weekly journey to unlocking your inner radiance, nurturing fulfilling relationships, and becoming the best version of yourself.
Welcome back to another episode. I'm Dr. Nicole, your guide on this journey to really tapping into your feminine essence. So let's pull the curtain back on this topic of boundaries. And I know you've heard so much about boundaries, especially in the last few years. Everybody's telling you to have boundaries, stand on business, know how to say no, right? It's part of just the common conversation now. And I think that is wonderful. I actually started years ago, I started my platform, Boundaries to Bliss, to really help women to understand the importance of boundaries as like a core part of the foundation of a healthy relationship, not only with other people, but a healthy relationship with yourself. So I think boundaries are key, but I think we've got to up the conversation a little bit because it's more than a notion, as they say, and it's more than just saying no. We've got to be a little more nuanced and sophisticated because just like with anything in life, people start to get acclimated. And so I think sometimes the whole thing about saying no, while that is important, it's got to go a little bit deeper because I think people have heard all of that before. And just because you come out saying no doesn't mean you're really truly comfortable with your boundaries or asserting them in a healthy way. So we're going to dig into it. Now, as you can guess, right, most of these topics, I have a very personal relationship with them. And for me, it wasn't always easy to have boundaries. A lot of it was more mental and emotional. I had to learn that boundaries really, I had to have emotional boundaries with things, learning not to take everything personally or not feel overly responsible for other people. So before I could even think about saying no, I had to learn that I wasn't responsible for other people's reactions or what they decided in their life or whether they asked me for advice and then ignored it and didn't take it. That wasn't my responsibility. And so that was a really like big, huge first step in me developing healthier boundaries. And it was something that really evolved like when I was in my 20s and just seeing how in certain friendships things were unbalanced and I had to learn that in order to have a healthy marriage, I had to, it wasn't even just about boundaries with my spouse within the marriage, but showing that I had boundaries with other people showed how I was able to prioritize my marriage and my relationship. And that was really a turning point in my relationship and just how I felt within my marriage. So, boundaries had to start within. So, what exactly are boundaries? We are hearing it, right? I use the phrase that people are saying you have to stand on business with your boundaries. And it has this image of this thing where you're just not going to back down. And sometimes, quite frankly, it might be that. But a lot of times, it's a more subtle experience, it's a more subtle communication. And it starts with what you think about boundaries and what your understanding of boundaries is. So, one definition that I love is simply that boundaries are limitations, right? They are the limits that we set for ourselves in relationships and in interactions with other people to protect our well being. And this ensures that there's understanding between us, but that our needs can be met and boundaries are essential for helping us to maintain a sense of self respect. And I always say that self respect, dignity, those things are a huge part of your femininity and really leaning into your feminine essence. And so to have healthy boundaries, you have to have healthy relationships. You have to have a healthy self respect, a healthy respect for yourself. You have to be someone that doesn't allow others to walk all over you or take advantage of you or disregard you or treat you in a certain way. And so that's where those limits come in. And boundaries can take all kinds of forms. Of course, there's physical boundaries, like that is really easy to see. There are emotional boundaries, like I alluded to, mental boundaries, and that a lot of times is even with it yourself. Sometimes, of course, sexual boundaries, you often need financial boundaries. And this can come up. Seen a lot of discussions about girls' trips and group trips that people go on, and how some people, there isn't communication or understanding or a clear sense of what the boundaries are. And so some people come with a lot of money, some people come with no money, and it's all mayhem. So you need financial boundaries, often spiritual boundaries, right? We have to understand where we start and stop and where another person starts and stops. And sometimes we feel like because somebody else had an experience, whether it was a spiritual experience, religious experience, that we have to either agree with that or go along with that or make that our experience. And so boundaries really are a part of saying, I'm separate from you, and that's okay. So we said physical, emotional, mental, financial, sexual, spiritual, even digital boundaries. How you use these digital devices, this social media. So we're really in an age where we actually have the power to curate our experiences with other people and in our relationships. And that's really what boundaries are about. And the other key thing about boundaries is they help us to communicate our what we value and what our limits are to other people. So if you think about all of that, then while no is a complete sentence, it's not the only sentence in this whole boundaries matrix. You got to get a little more sophisticated. So, as I said, some of the benefits of boundaries are that they communicate self respect to people. And so, when I was in my space of wanting to please other people, so the opposite of boundaries, or what sort of contributes to not having healthy boundaries and not honoring yourself, is feeling like you are responsible for pleasing other people. So, you get into people pleasing. That's where you get a lot of codependency, where you feel like it's your role to take care of and be responsible for other people. In some ways, you get a sense of importance and validation and fulfillment from that. But the flip side of it is you will end up doing things and saying yes to things that drain you, that suck the life out of you, that drain and take the happiness from you, because once you get wrapped up in that cycle and that game of being responsible for somebody else's happiness, you set yourself up for being on a nonstop wheel. You set yourself up also for expecting somebody else to be the root or cause of your happiness. So you're expecting other people to reciprocate certain things or do certain things just because you decided not to have boundaries and to people please. So it sets up this whole cycle that is just really draining, and it doesn't give self-respect, right? It's not giving self-respect, as they like to say. So when you are able to communicate healthy boundaries, you're showing what your needs are, and you're saying that mine are just as important as yours. It's not all about you. Healthy relationships are built on boundaries, because to have healthy boundaries, it really does go beyond saying no. And you have to be able to say, this is what I like. This is what I don't like. This is where I agree. This is where I disagree. This is where how I think we can collaborate or do this together. This is where I'm going to back away, right? So it requires you to be more intentional. When you are only saying no, you're more in a reactive mode. And true healthy boundaries are about being a little more proactive. Now, please do not get me wrong. No is an important tool in your boundaries toolbox. There's a great book that I love by one of my favorite authors, Gabor Mate, and he talks, it's called When the Body Says No. And it is like a case study in all of these examples of where people had chronic illnesses, some of them autoimmune illnesses, and it was a manifestation of ongoing psychological and emotional stress, essentially from lack of boundaries. Always feeling like their role was to please other people, make other people happy, a lot of times their parents or other key figures in their childhood. And in a sense, without boundaries, their bodies turned against them. And that's the key definition of autoimmune. It's like your body is attacking itself, it's seeing itself as an enemy, or parts of what are going on in the body as an enemy, an attacker. And in a way, that's what happens when you don't have boundaries. There's a part of your being that says, wait a minute, you're not protecting us. You're not doing your job. And as they say, if you don't take care of your health, will force you to sit down and take care of it. So we don't want to get into the mode of it's only reactive. You only say no when you're fed up. Healthy boundaries are knowing what your no's are in a general sense ahead of time. And so that requires you to have some self reflection. It also requires you to be flexible because sometimes there were things you didn't know that were limits for you. But when you're faced with them, you're like, okay, I'm not feeling comfortable with this. I'm not feeling good with this. And it is important to say no. I have found that just with myself and other women that I have coached and worked with, the hardest boundaries are not necessarily with the person on the street, the stranger, the person that you don't know, but it's with the people that you feel closest to, the people that you're afraid of disappointing, that you have felt it was your role to please, or that you have pleased in the past. So, a lot of times that can be caretakers, parents, siblings, other family members, your spouse, your children. It can play out at work. I know we talk a lot about what women of color face, but a lot of times it's that role of I'm the quicker picker upper, I'm the clean up woman. I'm here to fix things once they've fallen apart. And now they need somebody who can come fix things. And so that you need boundaries in situations like that because a lot of times you will be called upon, especially if you're a competent person, a competent woman of color, you will be called upon to fix things up. And if you don't have boundaries, you will run yourself right into the ground, right? So boundaries tend to be harder with the people we have established relationships with. And that's because we tend to feel a lot of guilt about disappointing other people, especially women. We're socialized to nurture, to care for, to caretake. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with those roles and those functions. They are absolutely beautiful. I think that's part of our feminine essence. But if you don't have boundaries, it quickly turns into being a doormat, not having a sense of self, no self respect, right? It quickly turns to being drained and resentful. And that's when your body starts turning against itself. The book I refer to, When the Body Says No, one of the things that Gabor Mate says in there is that, and this is one of my favorite phrases, it is better to feel the guilt of saying no, or to feel the guilt that may come with saying no, aka setting boundaries, than to experience the resentment of saying yes when you don't want to, aka no boundaries. So that's an acknowledgement that with boundaries, sometimes comes some discomfort. There may be some guilt, especially in the beginning. I always talk about the phases of setting boundaries, and that first phase is there's some guilt. That second phase is okay, I'm starting to feel this. That third phase is you're starting to get the pushback from people and you're wondering, oh God, like people are responding differently. They're not liking this. The next phase, the fourth phase is I don't give a you know what. Like everybody can just go to hell, basically. And then the fifth stage, the final stage, is where you're in less of a reactive mode. You're more comfortable. You're really just good within yourself with your boundaries, and your relationships are then flourishing at that point. So Gabor Mate says you have to be okay with that discomfort, and that the guilt you feel is always going to be way better for your being, for your body, for your whole self. That guilt is going to be better than the resentment of saying yes and you really just don't want it. Resentment builds up in your system. There's another great book I love called Toxic Emotions. That anger, that resentment, it can lead to things like heart disease. It can lead to depression and anxiety. It can exacerbate conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure. So these are things that we really don't want to play around with. And as women, when we say we want to lean into our softer side, that means having the boundaries to protect that inner feminine essence. You got to, if you want to have your soft side, your softness flourishing, you also have to protect it. And that's what healthy boundaries do for you. It's also a sense of personal empowerment. And I think this comes from learning to be able to stand up for yourself and advocate for yourself, but also knowing that you can be a little bit flexible. So, one of my favorite ways of thinking about this is you want to have boundaries, not barriers. You want to have limits, not walls. Barriers are like, hey, stay out, don't come here. It's almost like danger zone, toxic zone, don't come here. And that really keeps people out. And that might end up feeling safe for you, but it's really a hindrance and it's going to block, it's going to actually be a wall to true intimacy and connection. And so I hear a lot of women talk about how it takes so much for a man to really see their heart and get in there because they've been hurt so badly. They just have up these walls. And that is understandable, but that's not the goal, right? If you do a self assessment and self reflection and you recognize that you have these thick walls around you and somebody literally needs a sledgehammer or something and axe to get through those walls, then you might want to do some work on that. You want to soften up because you don't only want to have a soft core and you're just hard around the edges. You can soften up your edges too. Healthy boundaries don't mean being hard. It just means that you know what your limits are. You know what you're in touch with yourself to know what you're comfortable with and what you're not. And you are working on your communication to be able to say that before it gets too far. Let me give you an example. And I'm going to give you example in each area. So let's talk about friendships. If you have a friend that you feel like it's out of balance, they are constantly asking you to bail them out of situations, to give them money, to come pick them up, to do this, to do that. They're calling all the time, same sob story after sob story. The same guy, they keep breaking up, they're not, and then keep getting back together. It feels like everything, the energy is always towards that friend and what they need. So, boundaries would be saying, hey, I'm noticing a pattern and I'm not feeling good about it. It feels we're in a season in this friendship where it's all about you and what you need, whether it's financially or emotionally or attention wise. And that's not feeling so good to me, right? I feel like in this season, I need a more balanced, equal, or reciprocal friendship. You see that? So it's not just cutting a person off or griping, getting online to gripe to the internet about how you're sick of these people. It's actually utilizing communication and sharing what you need. Now, from there, if this person still engages in this, then you have to decide what the consequences are. No, I can't bail you out this time. No, I can't. It's late at night. I don't have the time or energy for you to trauma dump on me about your relationship again. So you can put into action what your limits are. Let's take another example. Let's talk about in your relationship. So let's say your partner does this little thing, right? He's like doing this thing that you just cannot stand. He's always looking at his phone when you're talking to him, or he doesn't acknowledge important occasions. Let's think about the love languages. Maybe it's quality time that you value, or words of affirmation and affection, or if it's acts of service, right? And if there's that one little thing that your spouse is constantly doing and you just don't like it, it makes you feel unseen, unappreciated. The important thing to do would be to talk about it. I know it sounds simple, but the communication is actually a part of setting the boundaries. So it could be like, I know that notice this pattern that you do such and such. And I feel like it's probably something really small to you, but to me, it's a really big thing. And I want to tell you why. And I hope that you can hear me because I want you to better understand me and why this thing is so important to me. And then you can proceed to communicate it. You can maybe tell the story behind it. When I was a little girl, I didn't always get the validation that I wanted. And then I realized that words of validation or words of affirmation were so important to me. And that's why in my relationship, I value it so much. So you're still taking ownership, you're communicating, and you're also saying what's important to you, which is a form of setting boundaries. Now, sometimes you might have to set more firm boundaries. If there's infidelity, if there is any kind of what feels like complete disregard for you financially or emotionally or in terms of anything in your relationship where it's more than just a preference, but it's like crossing a line, then you will have to say clearly, this is a boundary for me. And this is how I'm feeling. And this is what I would like to see. And you can say all of that in a very clear, calm, and feminine way. But that's the different levels of setting boundaries. Now, with your kids, you may need to set other kinds of boundaries depending on their ages. Or maybe if you don't have kids, you interact with kids. And if you interact with kids, the one thing you know is that they actually respond well to and they respect boundaries. Sometimes they even push their behavior to to trigger the adult in the room to set boundaries. It's like they know that the natural state, the natural order of things is to have boundaries, right? So they want those limitations. And so sometimes if you see your kids acting out, it's like they need you to set some boundaries. They need you to say, no, that's not going to fly. And I feel like most human relationships thrive on a sense of clarity around what's not going to fly with you, the same way that kids do. It's in work relationships, any kind you're working with clients, you need to have a clear sense of boundaries because it helps everyone involved to feel safer because they understand you're communicating what you value and what's acceptable. So it's really a matter of personal empowerment. And all the research backs this up. You all know I love talking about research because I feel like where's the evidence, right? We can sit here and share opinions and say all of these things, but I want to see what the evidence is. Tons of mental health research talking about, especially people who can set clear boundaries between their work life and their personal life. They have much lower levels of stress, higher levels of job satisfaction or career satisfaction, and lower levels or lower likelihood of burnout. So burnout tends to be a direct result of not having healthy work life boundaries. And I know with the whole online world and COVID and things like that, it has gotten harder. So that's why you have to be much more deliberate about it. Of course, relationships, as I alluded to, it helps to create a sense of safety and trust. It helps you to lower like nasty, unhealthy conflict because you're communicating more about what your needs are. They're communicating about theirs. And so it just makes you both feel, bottom line is you feel safer with each other. We tend to feel less safe and therefore less lower satisfaction when we don't know what's going on with the other person, or we feel like we can't share what's going on with us as far as our wants, our needs, and so forth. Now, here's a word on toxic relationships where there aren't any boundaries. One thing is those relationships can feel exciting because it triggers, like, there's an unexpectedness to it. So when you have healthy boundaries in a relationship, it's almost like there's a bit of stability that creates stability. And for people who have never had stability, they're used to being drawn to the toxicity, the excitement, the I don't know what's going to happen next, and even the adrenaline of having these intense conflicts and arguments and things like that. And it's easy to get addicted to that. And so when you're in a healthier space with healthier boundaries and knowing what your limits are, communicating them back and forth, blah blah blah, it can feel boring and it can feel like, okay, this is not really boundaries cuz I haven't had an argument yet. But the key is healthy boundaries should be taking place. It should be a way of life before you even get to having to just always be yelling no. Remember when Will Smith smacked Chris Rock and everybody was like, oh, his boundaries, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, if you're at the point where you're yelling and slapping people, there's been a failure of boundaries up to that point because you're having to explode. So we don't want to get to that point. Other thing as far as the research, emotional resilience, yes, because you're able to communicate, you're able to take more risks because you're not afraid of being run all over because you know that you know how to practice healthy boundaries. But here's the other, this is the one of my favorite sort of areas of the research has to do with boundaries in your physical health. And that's what that book was talking about. And so maintaining healthy boundaries, there was one key study in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine. When it comes to personal time and self care, taking time for yourself, practicing self care, that is associated with better health outcomes in terms of weight, diseases like hypertension, diabetes, risk for cancer. So we know that diet and exercise and all of that have to do with those more chronic illnesses, but it's also your overall lifestyle and your emotional well-being, which boundaries are a core part of that. And so when you're able to prioritize your own needs, you're more likely to just one, engage in healthy behaviors that are important for a healthy lifestyle, but you're minimizing all of that resentment and that built up frustration that then you either are holding in and that affects you internally, or you're expressing or dealing with those things through unhealthy behaviors like over, emotional eating, being sedentary, getting caught up in doom scrolling on your phone and things like that, looking for arguments. Sometimes we look for arguments because we're trying to get some frustration off. Ladies, has that ever happened to you, right? You feel like you're suppressed in certain areas of your life and you're trying to get some of that frustration off and you just want to start an argument. You might start an argument with your man, you might project or displace your anger onto your kids or anything like that. So that's a sign that you need some healthier boundaries. Some other signs so I say three key ways that you know you need healthier boundaries. One, you're constantly drained, like you're drained. You are just feeling like, no matter how much I sleep, or feel like I'm resting, I am drained and it's more of a mental thing, right? Two is you feel that resentment, right? You could feel it. Usually it's something in your body where you're like irritated, low key mad, have like just anger boiling up. And three is you don't have the resources, either financial, so you never have the money to do what you want because you've either been giving it to everybody else, or you're engaging in unhealthy coping that's draining your money. So you can't do with your money, you can't attract money or do with it what you really want to, or you don't have time, right? Money and time are our two most precious resources. So if you're not managing those well, it's a matter of rebalancing your boundaries. All right. So, what are some things you can do to start having healthy boundaries beyond just saying no? What are some ways that you can really start to honor yourself beyond just yelling out, oh, no, you're not going to cross my boundaries? One is identify your needs. Really take the time to identify your needs. And sometimes what you'll find is there may be people or specific groups, like a certain type of person that is harder for you to have boundaries with. You let that person walk all over you. They may symbolize something that you see of yourself in that person. And that's usually when you're over identifying, like you're projecting onto that person something about yourself. So then it's harder. You're trying to treat that person like you would treat yourself, when you need to just really identify your own needs and love up on yourself. And the other thing is, again, practicing communication. How do you say things with I statements that don't just come in and like explode on people, but knowing when you need to be firm, when you need to be clear, and when you need to be vulnerable? That's another way of expressing your boundaries, because sometimes it's not all about just coming out the gate with these demands and consequences and so forth, which, by the way, boundaries are not ultimatums. You can't force, boundaries are not about forcing someone to do something. It's about saying what your limits are. And then from there, if they don't respect them, then it's about what is your response going to be. But a boundary is not an ultimatum. A boundary is not, if you don't propose to me, then it's over. Or if you don't propose to me within 6 months, then I'm leaving. Or you have 6 months to do this and this, right? That's an ultimatum. That's not a boundary. You should have set expectations and boundaries way prior to having to put someone up to an ultimatum. And if you didn't do that, it's okay, right? You can take a step back and you can learn to communicate boundaries, but it's not an ultimatum. You also got to be consistent, right? Think about with kids. If one minute you say, okay, no, you can't use the tablet while we're at TV or you at dinner, or you can't be scrolling on your phone while we're at dinner. And the next day you let them do it. Then the next day you come back mad and saying, I said not to do it. And then the next day you let them do it, right? You're being inconsistent. So think about all of the ways that you might be expressing inconsistency or displaying inconsistencies, so that it makes people feel like you're not serious about your boundaries. The other thing is you do have to learn to say no. And it's not just learning to utter the words, but it's like how you say it. How do you say no? And for me, communication is about different notes that you have, the ups, the downs, the different intonations. So there's different types of no's. And so the more you start getting comfortable saying no, it could simply be like, no, I'm not going to, or no, thank you, or I said no, right? Sometimes if it's a stranger or you're setting a physical boundary, I said no. Sometimes if it's in a more intimate a relationship with your spouse, and they're asking you something, you say, no, I don't want to. I don't want to. No. Right. There's different ways you can say it. So the more you become intimate and comfortable with the word no, you'll understand which no you need to use and you'll be really comfortable with it. And sometimes it could just be somebody wants you to do something. Hey, girl, we're all doing such and such. Oh, thanks for the invitation, but no, thank you. I won't be going. But I appreciate being asked. No, I don't want to go. I'm practicing that a lot, especially as I am in my more introverted homebody phase. I'm having to turn down a lot of things. And it's just simply thanks for the invitation. No, I won't be coming, but I really appreciate it. And then the other thing is, if you are really struggling in the area of boundaries, you don't hesitate to seek support. That is one of the healthiest ways to actually prioritize your needs is to seek help with the things that you're having difficulty with. And that is exactly what my group coaching community, which is called the Boundaries to Bliss Society, is about. It's like helping women to navigate the communication of boundaries, but first, the identification of what their boundaries are and why they're important to them and how they're going to communicate them. I also go into it in my book, The Boundaries to Bliss Blueprint. So the links for both of those are in the show notes. So let's get to some questions. Question one is, how can I set boundaries without feeling guilty? So, one thing I would say is don't let feeling guilty stop you. So, if you start to feel guilty and you take that as a sign to not set boundaries, I want you to rethink that. Feeling guilty is actually a sign that you're on the right track. That feeling will diminish as you get more and more used to it. But you need to think about sound boundaries as an act of self-respect. It's not selfish, it's self-respect. And remind yourself that your well being is just as important as anybody else's, especially that person or those people that you're trying to please by not having boundaries. So you deserve to honor your own needs. And know that even if you haven't seen it before you, it's okay to prioritize yourself, but don't let the guilt stop you. Just know that it's normal. Remember, it's better to feel that guilt than to feel the resentment later. But the guilt will go down, and especially if you remind yourself that it's part of self-respect. It's not selfish. So the second question is, and a lot of people face this, what should I do if someone doesn't respect my boundaries? Yes, that's when we talk about what are the consequences. So one of the things is you don't want to be reactive. You don't want to have to go off and snap off on people the minute you feel like your boundaries are being crossed. You want to be able to reinforce them calmly and assertively. So you want to clearly communicate what your boundary was and what is your consequence. Like I told you, I'm not able to talk to you every night at 10 o'clock where you trauma dump on me. So I'm not going to be able to talk to you right now. Maybe we can set up a time later this weekend. Or I told you that I don't like when you constantly ask me for money when you get in a jam because you haven't managed your own money. So, no, I won't be giving it to you. And you don't even have to go into all those explanations. It's really up to you. Like sometimes you can say, no, I'm not able to. But if you want the person to understand or you want to prevent them from continuing to ask those things, in the future, then you can give a little more explanation. But sometimes you may have to distance yourself, right? If it's really about toxic family members, people who are caught up in their own sort of being unhealed, looking for drama, trauma dumping, being toxic, quite frankly, you may have to distance yourself from them. And again, that is both an act of self love, but it's also, you can do that with people that you love. It's also an act of love because what you're saying is, I'm not going to enable that behavior, that behavior that is destructive to both you and myself, right? So it's an act of self love. Distancing yourself is okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Again, it may be hard, but rest assured, it is often in those really like ongoing chronic situations, it is often the best route that you have to take. And you may have to, if you have some toxic, no boundaries relationships in your life, you may have to write down exactly what your limits are, what are the consequences, and be prepared at that point, as they say, to stand on business, right? So you see, as we have unveiled and pulled the curtain back on boundaries, it is more than just running around and saying no. And so, as you are on your boundaries journey, I want you to know that it takes courage to do what you're doing. And even if you don't get it right every time, the fact that you understand the importance of boundaries and you're trying to keep at it so that you can be the best version of yourself, then kudos to you. And a final note on this, right? Because I always hear people talking about feminine women and soft women, and oh, I don't want to be run all over. True feminine women, true women who are truly tapped into their softness, these are women that have some of the healthiest boundaries. The most feminine women I know, true femininity, they have the healthiest boundaries. That's how they protect their femininity. They don't let a lot of toxicity in. They're more clear about what's acceptable to them and what's not. They learn how to communicate in healthy ways. And so their boundaries are on point. It's the people that are running around yelling and screaming, they need to work on their boundaries because they're going from 0 to 10 without any in between. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Don't forget, my book, The Boundaries to Bliss Blueprint, goes deeper into this. And if you want a community that can really help you supercharge your boundaries, please look at the link for the Boundaries to Bliss Society, my community that includes a group coaching program. Until next time, embrace your power, nurture your spirit, and let your feminine essence shine. This is Dr. Nicole. I'll see you next time.